insight for the long case. Hello Dr. Humans, today I'm going to be talking about insight for the long case. In this video we're going to cover what is insight, what are the problems with having a lack of insight, and how should we approach discussing insight in our long case. It's going to be high yield indeed. And I must say that this video is really a product of a discussion between my students and my team of coaches at Rock Your Long Case. So I just wanted to give credit for the collaborative nature of what I'm about to say. And be sure to watch this video all the way to the end because I'm creating something brand new to help with your long case journey and it's coming in May. So watch to the end for all the details. Okay, so first up, what is insight? The way that I conceptualise insight is comparing the patient's viewpoint to your own medical viewpoint and seeing if they match. If the patient shares the same viewpoint as us, we would label them as having good insight, right? They understand their medical problem and the consequences of that medical problem. Another example of this is understanding the consequences of engaging in your healthcare or taking a particular medication or not. If someone has a cardiac stent, they should be on aspirin. If the patient understands that if they don't take their aspirin, then they could have an in-stent thrombosis, then again, that's a patient with good insight. So insight in and of itself is about comparing the patient's view with our trained medical opinion. But one of the things to remember here is that insight doesn't always meet up with action. And one of our all-star coaches, Ken, explained this really well. He gave the example of having lunch as a doctor. So he knows that he should have lunch, but he's often busy and distracted and things pop up during the day and sometimes he realises he's missed lunch. So it's not that he doesn't have insight into the benefit of lunch, but doctor life gets in the way. And this can happen with our patients, right? So a patient might be non-adherent with their medications or they might not go to appointments. That doesn't in and of itself equate to a lack of insight. They might be well aware that they need to take their medications or go to that appointment, but for whatever reason, it's inconvenient or there's barriers in place and they're struggling to fulfill that in some way. So it's not an insight problem, there's a barrier to adherence, and that's different. And another really great point that came up on the weekend is that patients can have variable insight. So in one area, the patient can be very insightful, and then in another area, they just don't seem to have a grasp on their medical problems. So when you're assessing someone's insight, or if the examiners are asking you about your thoughts on someone's insight, I think it's helpful to translate this question in your mind into how does this patient's perspective on their medical problems differ from my own? And then you can acknowledge where that's good and where that could improve. Before we get into how you might handle insight in your discussion, it's important to think about why this is important. Why are the examiners so interested in this little buzzword, insight? In other words, what are some problems with lack of insight? Ultimately, this narrows down to two concepts. The first is adherence and engagement. So, as we said before, you can have non-adherence not because you don't have insight or understand your problems, but because of various barriers to adherence, being busy, all the things, right? Nothing to do with insight. But equally, if a patient does have poor insight into their medical problems, it's not going to help adherence and engagement at all. The two things may or may not be connected, and that's something that you can be sure to point out in your discussion, where things are connected or not. The other place where insight is important is in future care planning, and we see this all the time. A good example would be someone who has organ failure, and they've been told that they're not suitable for a transplant. But despite that, they'll tell you that they're still working towards this. But again, this one can be tricky because it's mixed in with hope and coping strategies. It's very hard. And maybe it's not that the person really thinks this, but they want to believe in it so bad. They want to have that hope and they don't want someone to take it away from them, right? And because that's where their head's at, they don't engage in their future care planning. They don't want to do an advanced care plan because they'd rather focus on having a transplant. So again, here, insight is our comparison of our perspective versus their perspective But when it comes to this prognostic piece, we also have to acknowledge what might be shaping this perspective. If they have their head in the sand, that's probably a coping strategy, because it's hard being in these situations. So that brings me to the reasons that insight is important in your long case patient. The whole purpose of assessing insight in your long case patient is so that you can meet the patient where they are and then take them on a journey with you. So if you can get inside your patient's head and see the world from their perspective, then you have a better chance of constructing a management plan that will actually apply to them, that will actually benefit them, and that is the kind of management plan that one should be constructing in their long case. And so if your patient is lacking insight and it's an education issue, then you can for sure provide that education. Or if they're choosing not to accept their medical condition for what it is, if their head's in the sand and that's how they're going to cope with things, then that's an opportunity for you to meet them where they are, flip your communication style to one that's right for that patient, and take them on a journey with you. And that brings me to my final point today, which is how should you discuss and handle insight? And here I wanted to start off with what not to do. These are things I see all the time and they are definitely things to avoid. When you're talking about insight, I do not want you to come across as condescending or patronising or putting the patient down. That'll really irk the examiners, right? Some people make comments about people's poor health literacy or spill some comments onto the situation which sound a little bit judgmental, right? They put themselves above the patient and the patient below them. It's not a nice sound, okay? So whatever you do when you're discussing insight, you should avoid judging, patronising, and basically insulting the patient. That is not going to fly. What you want to do is be very objective, emotionally neutral, and be on the patient's team. As I said before, assessing insight is about meeting the patient where they are and going on a journey. It's about understanding how they see the world, how they interact with their medical conditions, acknowledging where that perspective might be detrimental, and working with the patient to improve their health outcomes. So, when it comes to answering questions about this in your discussion, you want to be very respectful and emotionally neutral, and never, ever, 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 ever put the patient down in any way. It's about being on the same team as your patient. Okay, with that said, let's see how you might approach this in your long case. So, the examiner asks you, what do you think about Jimmy's insight? First, you want to convey your assessment of their insight, which again really just means how does this patient's perspective on their medical problems and prognosis differ from your own medical perspective? And in doing so, you want to point out where this is good or bad or variable. And you want to comment on the impact of this insight issue on the patient. Is that leading to adherence issues? Or is it affecting their expectations of what healthcare can provide? Is it obstructing their future care planning, such as not having an advanced care plan? But of course, remember that insight can be very good, but they might just have an adherence issue, or their advanced care plan might not be solid for a multitude of other reasons. So only connect those things if they are actually connected. Otherwise, be sure to point out that they are in fact disconnected. So when insight is not the root cause of a problem with adherence or future care planning, you want to acknowledge that and then identify what are the barriers to those things and then help the patient to overcome the barriers. And so once you've stated what you think about their insight and how it affects their management, you next want to describe how you are going to work with the patient to move forwards. So again, that concept of meeting the patient where they are and going on the journey. So if they don't have good insight into a medical problem, you could educate them on that medical problem. You might also educate family members who are involved in the patient's care. And of course, if there seems to be a lack of understanding despite education, then it would be appropriate to assess that person's cognition. Maybe that's the issue. And in that case, building in the external supports to facilitate a viable management plan might be the best way forward. Or if the patient is at a place where they have unrealistic expectations about their prognosis, about their healthcare, you might say that you would explore this with them in future consultations. framing your discussion in a way which meets them where they are. So in real life, if I have a patient like that who really needs the hope, they really need the hope, they don't necessarily want you to destroy their hope during the consultation. They'll just literally never see you again. In that scenario, I would provide two plans. Telling the patient, let's plan for the worst case scenario and then hope for the best case scenario. And then we'll see where we end up, right? That kind of conversation where you're still holding space for the patient in their current mindset. And whilst you know that the likely path is the likely path, you can progress their future care planning in a way that they find tolerable and acceptable and they're still happy. Now that I think about it, I might actually do another video on advanced care planning. It goes a bit beyond insight and it's quite relevant to your long case, so maybe next week I'll do that. Watch this space. So, just to wrap up the key things about assessing insight. Insight is the comparison of the patient's perspective to your own medical perspective. Insight is important because it can affect adherence, engagement, and future care planning. When discussing insight, make sure that you are doing so in a way that is supportive, emotionally neutral, and which does not insult the patient. Insight can be variable in any one person, so we should acknowledge the good and bad aspects of insight. When there is a lack of insight, your discussion should be framed by acknowledging their insight, how this affects their care, and how you are going to construct a care plan with that insight in mind. Hashtag winning physician-led care plan. So, that's all I have to say on insight for your long case. I hope that was helpful, and if you are looking for more support with your long cases, I have a whole program dedicated to this, and it's called Rock Your Long Case. In this program we cover all the things: history taking, issues list, how to think and sound like a physician, and so many juicy toots on transplant, dialysis, rheumatology, not to mention those gen med topics. We're talking diabetes, obesity, peri-op med, behaviour change, adherence, osteoporosis, falls, and so much more. So if you are looking for a course that gives you long case confidence so you can shine on exam day, then come along to Rock Your Long Case. And I said at the start I had something new. I do have something new, it's so exciting. It's a long case coaching platform. So for students enrolled in the program, they'll be able to book in for small group lessons with myself and the Long Case All-Stars throughout the month of May. It's going to be an absolute blast. So if that sounds like something you need in your life, then head on over to my website and join us for Rock Your Long Case 2023. There's still plenty of time to take advantage of all the juicy learning. And otherwise, stay tuned here on YouTube for some more long case lessons. Bye!